of the best features about Resident Evil is the fact that a majority of the mainline games have a lot of replayability. Even though some of the entries of the series are linear stories, Capcom usually tries to find exciting ways to motivate us to replay our favorite games of the series again and again and again. Whether that's via custom changes, unlockable modes, or branching narratives. Something about our favorite Resident Evil game keeps drawing us in to revisit it multiple times, even 2 or 3 decades after its release in some cases. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, I'll be taking a look at every mainline Resident Evil game as I rank them all based on their replayability. As always, this list will be based on my own personal opinion. However, I would love to hear about which Resident Evil game do you find yourself replaying the most in the comments down below. Also, when I say mainline entries, that means I'll be focusing on the numbered entries, the remakes, the Revelation games, and Code Veronica. And in most cases, I'll be ranking the remakes and the original entries of the series as a single entry. There is one exception to this rule, but we'll get to that later on. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is every Resident Evil game ranked by replayability. Let's get it. Number 13, Resident Evil Revelations. When I think about the games that replayed the least, the first Revelations game is the first one that comes to my mind immediately. While I definitely don't think it's worse than RE6 or even the second Revelations game, there's unfortunately not a lot of things about this game that makes me want to revisit it more than every other year, to be honest. The story is one-dimensional, and it feels like it's an espionage game versus a survival horror game, complete with terrible side characters that take up way too much time when they are on screen. And while the gameplay is actually pretty good, and it's a step into a more horror-focused setting compared to other entries like RE5 and RE6, there's not really anything interesting that draws me back into it. The costumes suck, minus the samurai outfit for Keith, the enemy types get a bit repetitive halfway through the game, and the fact that you're almost always paired with another character yet there's no local or online co-op available, yeah, Revelations unfortunately doesn't do much to increase replayability. I will say though that Revelations and a sequel does deserve some brownie points for its raid mode. Number 12, Resident Evil 6. So when I first started to make this list, I actually thought Resident Evil 6 would be at the bottom of my list. I mean, the game is my least favorite mainline RE game, and the fact that it's 20 hours long, I really find it hard to revisit this game. Still, at least Resident Evil 6 does try a little harder than Revelations does in terms of replayability, hence why it moved up a single entry on today's list. Unfortunately, that's about as high as I can move Resident Evil 6 because it's still a game that I really don't like to replay that often. The biggest issue comes from the extremely long campaigns. With 4 main campaigns, each of which take up around 5 to 8 hours, Resident Evil 6 is not a simple game that you could just play and finish in a couple of days. It's a process to get through Resident Evil 6, and because of the bullet sponge boss fights, long drawn out cutscenes, and extremely repetitive enemy types scattered throughout each campaign, playing through the entire game all over again, even over a decade after its release, is just something that seems more like a chore to me. Still, the Mercenaries mode is one of the best in the series, and the different versus modes add some replayability as well, like Agent Hunt mode, but these additional modes died over time due to less and less fans playing Resident Evil 6 all of these years later and the lack of crossplay. Number 11, Resident Evil Revelations 2. A lot of the same issues that Revelations 1 had could also apply to Revelations 2. The episodic feel still takes the player out of the immersion of the game, and there's not a single costume that I like in Revelations 2. Still, there's a few features about Revelations 2 that help it be a little bit more replayable than Resident Evil 6 and the first Revelations game. First off, the combat system in Revelations 2 was relatively smooth. The story wasn't as drawn out as the first Revelations game, and it felt more in line with the horror roots that the Resident Evil franchise was built upon. But probably the biggest aspect of Revelations 2 that helps it stand above the first Revelations game in terms of replayability comes from having better bonus modes. Revelations 2 features additional episodes, a more improved raid mode, and my personal favorite, invisible enemy mode that adds a much more challenging and unique experience when replaying through the main story of the game. Number 10, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Comparing myself to a lot of the fans of the Resident Evil franchise, I honestly can say that I'm probably in the minority when it comes to my feelings about Resident Evil 3 Remake. While I do think it's a bad remake and it's not perfect, Resident Evil 3 is still a relatively fun game that I do find myself replaying a good amount of. Although it's worth mentioning that a big reason why I replay it so much comes from the fact that it's an extremely short game that I can get through in a few hours or less. The cutscenes are pretty awesome and the combat is extremely smooth with the dodge mechanic being improved drastically, but overall Resident Evil 3 Remake is just so replayable because of how easy it is to play it all the way through in one sitting. When looking at the features in the game, there's not too many things that add replayability. There's additional modes that increase the difficulty level, but outside of enemies being stronger, these modes don't really change up the game much like the invisible enemy mode or the madhouse mode seen in other Resident Evil games. Also, Resident Evil 3 Remake is surprisingly bad when it comes to unlockable costumes. This is actually pretty shocking because 1, the original game had tons of unlockable costumes for Jill, including a Dino Crisis outfit, and 2, Resident Evil 2 Remake actually did a pretty solid job with unlockable costumes. Yeah, all RE3 Remake did was give Jill her RE1 costume and both Jill and Carlos their original costumes from RE3 Nemesis, though they even fucked that up when it came to Jill's costume as well. The last 2 remaining things that add replayability are the in-game shop and the bonus game Resistance. However, I don't think it's fair to really count Resistance that much, as it pretty much died immediately after launch, and Capcom stopped supporting the game with updates within the same year it launched. Number 9, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica is actually one of the more challenging Resident Evil games out there. The learning curve of this game is brutal, as you can easily find yourself stuck and forced to load older saves in order to manage resources better so that you can take down difficult enemies later on in the game. This difficulty curve is actually one of the things that make replaying Code Veronica a little less enticing than other entries of the series that rank higher on today's list. Then when you add in the fact that this game is one of the last remaining mainline games that have yet to see either a remake, remaster, or even the famous seamless HD project and rebirth treatment, yeah, Code Veronica is in a less than ideal state than most Resident Evil games out there today. Regardless of that fact though, Code Veronica is a game that I find myself playing at least twice a year. Between the classic survival horror vibe of the game, the only game in which we see the Redfield siblings team up together, and a story that builds up the lore of the franchise more than most other entries of the series, Code Veronica is still a fun experience for fans of classic survival horror, and it's a game that I'll continue to replay over and over again as the years tick by. Number 8, Resident Evil 5. When it comes to RE5, there's a lot of elements that keep players entertained enough to revisit this game multiple times. In fact, I have a friend out there that claims that this is their favorite video game of all time, no lie. For one, the combat is extremely smooth and easy to get used to. Sure, the whole no aiming while moving thing could be annoying at times, but other than that, the combat in Resident Evil 5, especially against the boss fights, is pretty fantastic. Actually, the gameplay of Resident Evil 5 is why the Mercenaries mode is one of the best in the series. Then you have the final reunion between Chris Redfield, Albert Wesker, and Jill Valentine, 3 main characters that have been around since the very beginning of the Resident Evil franchise. Also, Sheva is one of the most underrated main characters of the series, to the point where fans are constantly begging Capcom to bring her back. As for unlockable content and DLC, RE5 has a handful of them that just keeps pulling players back again and again. You have one of the best story-based DLCs of the franchise in this game, Lost in Nightmares. You have tons of unlockable costumes for both Sheva and Chris, including throwback to previous games and other characters of the franchise. And you have an online co-op in both the main story of the game and Mercenaries, which allows players to play the game with friends. Of course, the drawback to this game being built with multiplayer in mind leads us to one of the biggest flaws in the game, the support character's AI. But we don't talk about that, now do we? Number 7, Resident Evil 0. When it comes to RE0, the classic survival horror gameplay mechanics complete with fixed camera angles yet modern graphics makes this game extremely easy for me to jump into every now and then. And considering that Rebecca Chambers is now in my top 3 favorite characters of the franchise, only behind Chris and Jill, this being the only game in which she's the main protagonist motivates me to replay this game more than most fans of the series. You also get a ton of additional features that increase replayability. You have a bonus game called Leech Hunter, a lot of different unlockable costumes for Rebecca Chambers, and my personal favorite feature, Wesker mode. Yet despite all of that, Resident Evil 0 has one major flaw that unfortunately makes playing through the game a major pain. That of course being the lack of an item box. While there have been plenty of action horror entries of the series that don't feature an item box, like the original Resident Evil 4 and Village, Resident Evil 0 attempts to do something different by giving us a survival horror game with limited inventory space, but nowhere to store key items that we don't need right away. For this reason, RE0 causes the player to backtrack a lot more than your traditional Resident Evil game, to the point where even future playthroughs of the game can become tedious and boring at times. Still, I personally love Resident Evil 0, and for that reason, I find myself revisiting it a lot more than I probably should, hence why it makes it so high up on today's list. Number 6, Resident Evil Village. While I personally rank Village pretty low on my own rankings of the RE franchise, it's hard to deny the fact that Village is definitely one of the most replayable games of the series. And no, it's not just because it's probably the best looking game of the series, but that's definitely a bonus. For one, Village has a handful of features today that can motivate players to replay the main story alone. The Village of Shadows difficulty challenges players more than the hardest difficulty in most Resident Evil games. Unlockable weapons like the double-bladed lightsaber allows the player to experience the main campaign in a completely different way. And the newest feature added to the game a year after its initial release, third-person mode, allows the game to be played in the same way as the modern remakes of the Resident Evil series, like RE4 Remake. Then when you throw in one of the best stories of the series, exciting boss fights and gameplay mechanics, series icon Chris Redfield, and the Shadows of Rose DLC, then it's not too surprising to see why Village ranks just outside of my top 5 most replayable Resident Evil games. Number 5, Resident Evil 7. From one first-person Resident Evil game to another, RE7 claims the number 5 spot on today's list. Despite RE7 and Village ranking back-to-back on this list, all of the games in the top 5 are all on a completely different tier level when it comes to replayability. So the gap is much bigger than it seems between Resident Evil 7 and Village when it comes to replayability. As for why, well, just look at how much you get out of Resident Evil 7. For one, the gameplay mechanics of Resident Evil 7 and the fact that it doesn't feel like a long semi-open world game like Village does allows us to easily jump back into the story of Resident Evil 7 much more than Village. Speaking of the main story Resident Evil 7, unlike Village of Shadows difficulty, Resident Evil 7 does a much better job at making the experience completely different in its hardest difficulty mode of the main story, Madhouse mode. Not only does this mode increase the difficulty level of the game like Village of Shadows does, but it also changes up item locations, enemy encounters, and even the order in which you might find yourself visiting some of the rooms within the Baker estate. Well, at least for the first half of the game. The second half of the game remains mostly the same, but the survival horror focus over action horror makes this game easier to dive into and play through multiple times compared to a much more aggressive game like Resident Evil Village. Then when you add in all of the additional post-game content modes like Ethan Must Die, 21, Not a Hero, End of Zoe, and every other additional DLC and mode in this game, then it's pretty clear to see why Resident Evil 7 claims a spot in the top 5 games of the franchise in terms of replayability. Number 4, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. RE3 Nemesis is the most ambitious game of the franchise when it comes to branching narratives. While most of the games of the series usually feature one or two big choices that can be made throughout their respective stories, RE3 Nemesis builds a whole mechanic around this concept, as the player will have multiple situations in which they'll need to make a tough choice that can change events in the game, add or remove certain boss fights, or even lead to one of 3 different endings depending on the choices made throughout the game. This is easily the biggest feature that allows Resident Evil 3 Nemesis to have so much replayability to it, but it's definitely not the only one. It was also the first game to introduce the famous Mercenaries mode seen throughout the 3-decade history of this franchise. On top of that, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis far outpaces the remake in terms of unlockable costumes. By my count, and I could be wrong so don't quote me on this, but Resident Evil 3 Nemesis has a total of 7 different alternate costumes for Jill Valentine, one of which is an outfit that's inspired by Regina from Dino Crisis. However, the 3 things that motivate me the most to return to this specific game at least 3 or 4 times a year is the unpredictable Nemesis that always keeps me on my toes, Jill Valentine becoming the badass that she was always meant to be, and the fact that this game allows the player to fully explore one of the most iconic cities in video games, Raccoon City. Number 3, Resident Evil 4 and its remake. If I were a betting man as to which game in this iconic franchise would claim the number 1 spot for most fans, my first guess would 1000% be Resident Evil 4 or its remake. Let's face it, while I've personally always been a bigger fan of the survival horror entries of the series, RE4 completely shocked the video game landscape and once again redefined horror with its take on action horror. And it's hard to deny the fact that both versions of this game may very well be the most replayed game of the franchise for some fans of the series. I mean, the gameplay in both versions of Resident Evil 4 is truly addicting, even more so in the remake in my opinion. Resident Evil 4 has some of the best boss fights in not only the Resident Evil franchise, but in all horror games period. And while the gameplay was extremely addicting in the original game, features included in the remake added to this experience even more. Small features like the player being able to move around while aiming to bigger changes like knife combat in Resident Evil 4 Remake help make this game one of the most exciting games to replay again and again. I mean, this game has been out for less than 2 years, and I've already replayed this game more times than other entries on this list, like Resident Evil Village. And with fan favorite Leon S. Kennedy leading the pack with his charming personality and famous one-liners, it's kind of hard to not put Resident Evil 4 in the number 1 spot. Especially when you add in the additional modes of the game, like the best DLC of the entire series in the form of Separate Ways, and the highly addicting staple of the franchise, Mercenaries. Plus, you have iconic unlockable costumes and weapons such as Ashley's suit of armor and Leon's Chicago typewriter that Resident Evil 4 just screams replayability no matter how many times you look at it. I may personally find myself replaying 2 other entries more than Resident Evil 4, but don't think it wasn't a tough call for me, because it was. I'd be a dumb sack of rocks if I didn't realize just how replayable Resident Evil 4 and its remake is, and with that in mind, it's a no-brainer for me that Resident Evil 4 at the very least has to crack the top 3 of today's list. Number 2, Resident Evil 2 and its remake. Call it personal bias, but Resident Evil 2, especially the original game of the franchise, has more replayability than Resident Evil 4 does in my own personal opinion. Perhaps that's due to my own preference of playing survival horror games and revisiting that subgenre more than any other type of video game out there. Still, that really shouldn't take away with how much both the original game and the remake gives us that ultimately creates some of the most replayable games of the entire Resident Evil franchise. Both versions of this game feature 2 iconic fan favorite characters of the series, rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy and the best little sister ever, Claire Redfield. Whether you play as Leon on his first day on the job or join Claire's search for her missing brother, both characters made a major impact with players to the point where they have both appeared in multiple games, live action movies, and even multiple CGI animated films. The RPD station is also one of the most iconic locations, only second to a different location that we'll talk about soon. The soundtrack is something that hits hard as well, as the original game still, to this day, has my favorite soundtrack throughout the entire franchise. I mean, I'm literally using the Resident Evil 2 save room theme as background music for a majority of my videos on this channel. And while we are on the topic of the original game, you have 2 mechanics there that increase replayability: the zapping system and the A and B scenario system. The latter of which included a brand new main villain, Mr. X, who stalked the player throughout the entire second scenario of the game. By adding these features to Resident Evil 2, the main story could be played a total of 4 times, giving us 4 different unique playthroughs of the main campaign of the game. On top of that, Resident Evil 2, depending on which version of the game we are looking at, had different features throughout the years that also increase replayability. The N64 port of the game included an item randomizer mode, as well as the ability to change the color of blood. Most versions of the original game also featured a bonus game called Extreme Battle Mode, which even included a new character model of Chris Redfield created specifically for this mode. And in the remake, you have the Ghost Survivors DLC, which created what-if scenarios with some of the side characters of the main game. But we can't move on without mentioning one of the most iconic bonus modes ever, the Force Survivor as well as Tofu Survivor. These games were seen in every version of the game, including the remake, and it still remains to this day one of the most exciting bonus games in Resident Evil. Number 1, Resident Evil Remake. Yeah, my most replayable game of the entire Resident Evil franchise is the remake of the original nightmare itself, Resident Evil 2002. Now technically, I did include the original game on this list, so feel free to either include it with this entry or just put it somewhere around Code Veronica, but either way, there's no Resident Evil game that I find myself replaying more than the 2002 remake of the original game. For one, it's my second favorite game of the series, just outside of the original Resident Evil 2. Also, its setting, the Spencer Mansion, is by far the most iconic and scariest location in the entire Resident Evil franchise. Nothing, not in any horror game, compares to the intense atmosphere created when exploring the Spencer Mansion, regardless if it's your first playthrough or your 30th. The characters are also top notch, with every single main character in this game becoming so memorable that the franchise would bring them back in both films and future games. The game also featured branching narratives based on some small choices made throughout the game, although the original version of Resident Evil definitely handled this mechanic much better. It also featured 2 separate campaigns by allowing the player to play as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield. While most of the gameplay elements remain mostly the same, story details and side characters changed with each campaign. And as a major fan of survival horror, the 2002 remake of Resident Evil still to this day captures the true essence of survival horror better than any other horror game out there. The limited resources, tedious backtracking, fixed camera angles, challenging puzzles, and inventory management combine to create the best classic survival horror vibe in the series, but complete with modern, ahead of its time graphics. And all of this is said before we start looking at the bonus features. Alternate costumes and different modes in both the original game and the remake allow the player to fully experience the entire story all over again. For example, the remake featured an invisible enemy mode, which is basically self-explanatory, a one dangerous zombie mode, in which an indestructible Forrest will run around with his vest of grenades on him that, if you shoot him, it immediately gives you a game over, and a real survival mode which took survival horror and basically gave it steroids to make it a much more intense playthrough. While these features definitely added to the replayability factor, the fact is that Resident Evil Remake is just the easiest and most fun game to play through multiple times. As the perfect storm of classic survival horror mechanics complete with modern graphics, there's really no other survival horror game that I replay more than Resident Evil Remake. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Resident Evil Remake the most replayable game of the entire franchise, or is there a different game that you think that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like in today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.